between the time of 3:15 a.m. or 3¼ hours into the invasion and 3:30, many dramatic changes had occurred on the battlefield within the installation of Fort Sill, as well as its surrounding area in the city of Lawton, the small town of Cache, and many farms, ranches, and country homes immediately outside of the vicinity of the city and installation. In the previous video, the forces in the northwest corner of the installation, primarily training forces and a sizable number of trainees that had, at the time of the invasion, been preparing to conduct live fire training exercises with the Alpha and Bravo battery of the 2nd of the 2nd, as well as the 1st of the 30th Battalion, both belonging to the 422nd Field Artillery Brigade, as there were also skeleton crews of the 434th, both brigades having forces still on this installation, as the 434th was mostly, by this point, forward deployed to provide force protection measures for the Shepherd Air Force Base, although, again, it had left certain batteries of its larger battalions on Fort Sill to continue with training operations as it currently stood. As artillery and 2 H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft, both equipped with the KG600 jamming pods, which, for their part, blanketed the entire area with their electronic warfare capabilities, pinpointing the origins of radio signals and radars and shutting them off with electromagnetic jamming. Targeted electromagnetic jamming, to be exact. And as this was occurring, all redundant communications, as well as radar systems that were portable and not connected to the internet or to the satellites that were downed by the anti-satellite strikes, were thus jammed by these very systems, as the tank or armored battalion and mechanized infantry battalion that had initially partaken in the Sqdn operations against the 31st Air Defense Artillery Brigade had destroyed much of its comprising units, with a single mechanized infantry battalion also from the same 181st Combined Arms Brigade of the PLA's 77th Group Army surrounded the 5th of the 5th, destroying it, before advancing to cut off retreat to the north out of the installation, intercepting and destroying the headquarters of Headquarters Battery over the entire 428th Field Artillery Brigade as it tried to flee for sheer survival out of the battle space, and thereby was intercepted and destroyed by this PLA Mechanized Infantry Battalion. As the Armored Battalion and other Mechanized Infantry Battalion, both of the 181st Combined Arms Brigade, had conducted their portion of the Sqdn operation against the 31st Air Defense Artillery Brigade, and thus moved to engage the forces in the northwest corner of the post, as previously mentioned. They now, after having defeated them soundly, moved in order to intercept fleeing small groups from the Schoolhouse Battalion of the 2nd of the 6th Air Defense Artillery Training Brigade, or Air Defense Artillery Training Battalion, rather, and the remains of the 1st of the 30th, having fled to the north, were thereby cut off by these armored and mechanized infantry forces and were therefore destroyed, as the Type 99A main battle tanks, such as these, had intercepted them rapidly, in addition to a fresh volley of CH-901A loitering munitions having had been fired from the 181st Combined Arms Brigade's Headquarters Battalion, thereby destroying vehicles and troops as they had tried to flee north. As all of this was well underway, The rest of the fighting on the installation occurring at this time was also erupting on the Henry Army Airfield, which itself was just adjacent to I-44 as it ran north-south through the installation, through the middle of the main post. It was being seized in an air assault operation being carried out by 2 battalions belonging to the 77th Special Operations Brigade of the PLA, which was transported into battle by the 2 transport helicopter companies comprised of the Z-20 utility helicopters, 32 per battalion, as the flying elements of this rotary aviation force, dropping them off at the Henry Army Airfield and thereby seizing the airfield before flying back to shuttle in more of these battalions, as they could only shuttle in specific companies at a time with their 64 total aircraft between the 2 transport helo companies, bringing in most of the 1st battalion that was set to occupy the area before bringing in the rest of that battalion and the additional battalion flown in to reinforce the hold they had on the airfield and establish a security perimeter to defend it, as the airstrips and airfields, including the local regional airport, the Lawton Fort Sill Regional Airport, control of them was of vital importance for future logistical operations, as well as bringing in additional troops for troop rotations upon the occupation of the nation post-invasion. As this battle to seize and secure the airfield was initially small, as time would go on, by hour number 4, as the rest of the Special Operations Brigade arrived by road, coming up I-44 from the Wichita Falls and Shepherd Air Base battle, which had ended relatively early, they would comprise the first batch of reinforcements in addition to the combat aviation assets of the 77th Aviation Brigade, being the 2 armed reconnaissance battalions of recon helicopters that were armed, as well as 2 attack helicopter battalions, which had already shown up and engaged elements of these training units in this portion of the installation, in conjunction with artillery strikes coming from howitzer-based artillery, as well as tactical ballistic missile and cruise missile strikes coming from the Chinese DF-15Bs and DF-21A tactical ballistic missiles, in addition to the YJ-18C container-based cruise missiles and Russian Caliber cruise missiles, also container-based, in addition to the heavy strategic bomber strikes and loitering munition strikes, with the ground fire combined with all the aforementioned, completely annihilating the forces in this sector before the Armored and Mechanized Infantry Battalion both moved north to cut off the retreat of any surviving groupings of troops that managed to flee out of the main post into the northern training areas, as the attack helicopter and armed reconnaissance helicopters continued north with them to also engage and destroy these forces in conjunction with the ground forces mentioned, before the attack helicopters moved to engage other forces of MPs that were fleeing the main post and headed north, being engaged and destroyed along the way, before the helicopters returned back south to their temporary bivouac area, as mentioned in the previous Shepherd Air Base Wichita Falls battle, which was set up outside of the city with supplies brought from their CCP regime property that they began upon, thereby putting them a bit closer to this operational area. As the munitions had been dropped from these 2 specific KG600 electronic warfare system equipped H-6K heavy strategic bombers, they began to turn around as the rest of the entire heavy strategic bomber squadron was set to follow them, as by this point, they had other strategic bombers that had already jettisoned their payload against the 75th Field Artillery Brigade and its comprising subordinate units, in addition to utilizing them against the 3rd of the 13th, which was also a subordinate unit of the 75th, but was temporarily posted at makeshift firing points of earthen berm works and sandbag machine gun emplacements and foxholes that were interlinked with interlocking fields of fire for defense, which had earlier fought against this lone combat engineer battalion that seized the southwest corner airfield at that initial battle. By this point, as the two companies that seized this southwest corner airfield were now holding it in conjunction with the headquarters company, which now moved up and established a command post at the airfield, the 5 other companies of their battalion had been continuously moving north before turning abruptly to the west to face off against the 1st Armored Division's Divisional Artillery Brigade, as its comprising units, which were 3 artillery battalions and 1 short-range air defense artillery battalion armed with the IMSHORADs or SHORAD IMs, these Strykers, essentially, with a short-range Stinger-based and 30mm autocannon air-to-ground, or ground-to-air system, rather, air short-range air defense. These forces were now engaging them as 2 battalions from the 15th Sustainment Bde had earlier moved into the area to conduct the training operations before the invasion even began, and they were setting up temporary campsites, including forward medical aid stations and supply points and other such sites that were to aid and facilitate the training operation underway between elements of the 75th Field Artillery Brigade and those of the 1st Armored Division's visiting Divisional Artillery Brigade in the area. As this was underway, one H-6K heavy strategic bomber once again had jettisoned its payload and smashed elements of the 3rd of the 13th, while there were 2 others left that hadn't dropped their payloads, as these 2 had hit the 75th Field Artillery Brigade up here at their primary sites, while the one that was diverted from the battle at Shepherd Air Force Base due to lack of need was instead diverted over here to aid the other H-6K heavy strategic bomber that was orbiting the area and about to strike. This, by this point, was occurring when the mid-air refueling aircraft of the Sino-Russian coalition had just refilled the local aircraft of the Su-35 squadron to keep them airborne, as well as the Su-34 ground attack squadron doing the same for them, as well as the other aviation assets of the PLAAF, like the J-11 squadron here, and all the other Chinese aircraft that were just to the south in the battle that was occurring over the Shepherd Air Base AO, or Area of Operations. However, though, as these mid-air refuelers were running low on fuel themselves and had already dispatched all their fuel to these aircraft, they were now returning to their home bases in Mexico to refuel and reload their tanks to get back in the air as fast as possible in order to sustain future sorties deep inland into the country, as the combat aircraft would eventually have to return and would need to rearm and refuel and conduct maintenance operations themselves. And therefore, by the time it was 4 a.m., all of the combat aircraft in this area would have carried out their operations having had to return to base and do an RTB to reload, as in rearm and refuel, as well as the mid-air refuelers doing the same in order to carry out the process once again of lingering over a battle space in order to refuel combat aircraft to keep them airborne as long as possible until they had expended all their ammunitions and had conducted whichever close air support or air superiority missions that were given to them. And as by this point, the entire USAF had been basically destroyed on the ground, with very few exceptions, the fighter aircraft would begin to be rearmed with strictly ground attack munitions, adding that much more of a punch from air-based assets of the fixed-wing combat aircraft involved in the entire operation, the invasion. As the 5 combat companies of the Combat Engineer Battalion operating in this southeast corner and eastern portion of the installation as a whole had continued to move up and turn to the west to attack the battalions belonging to the 1st Armored Division's Divisional Artillery Brigade, they now encountered the 4th of the 3rd, a Field Artillery Battalion consisting of M109A6 Paladins, in addition to the 4th of the 60th, the SHORAD element, in addition to smaller groupings of troops from the two support battalions from the 15th Sustainment Brigade that had moved into the area to establish supply points and aid stations and other related services to the combat units operating in this area. As the SHORAD air defense systems were relatively close in range in terms of the capabilities of the Stinger, and as well as even the 30mm autocannon to a certain extent, they were not deemed as much of an immediate threat to the VVS, which was the Russian Air Force aircraft, or the PLAAF aircraft of the Chinese. The artificial intelligence system having had already deemed them a minimal threat and advised commanders to have the squadron of H-6K heavy strategic bombers return as soon as possible in order to rearm, as they would be more efficient if they were rearmed quicker and thus committed back to combat ASAP instead of just lingering in the area continually providing the EW support in the form of their electronic warfare pods. As again, it wouldn't be a major issue to leave the area as far as the KG600 jamming pod equipped H6Ks were concerned, as they were again deemed more efficient to hurry back, reload, and recommit to the fighting instead of just lingering in the area to continually provide this support to the ground forces, as by this point, once again, the first thing that had been majorly achieved in the battle overall was the destruction of the 31st Air Defense Artillery Brigade with its Patriot missile systems comprising the Patriot battalions with their subordinate Patriot batteries. Having had destroyed all of these, which were longer range and much higher in altitude as far as their reach, the SHORAD air defenses of the visiting 1st Armored Division's Divisional Artillery Brigade was deemed a minimal threat and was thus able to be smashed by the H-6K heavy strategic bombers, 2 of which still haven't had unloaded their loads yet, this one and the one diverted from down south at the battle occurring at Shepherd Air Base, in order to smash these units into the proverbial dustbin of history. In addition to Su-35 strike aircraft, some of which themselves hadn't fully expended their payloads as well, having just gotten fresh fuel from the mid-air refuelers before they were turned back in order to make it to their bases, re-equip with fuel, and refuel themselves for a new mission. As all the combat was totally savage throughout this battle, with this battle lasting a handful of hours longer than did the fighting to the south at the Shepherd Air Base, there were still these groupings of American troops that had to be defeated, including the elements of the Divisional Artillery Brigade of the 1st Armored Division, the visiting units. Going to the map of just a small segment of the battle between the 5 combat companies of the Combat Engineer Brigade sent to engage the 4th of the 60th and 4th of the 3rd, the Artillery Battalion, comprised of its 4 firing batteries and HHB, or Headquarters Battery, Headquarters and Support Battery, rather. Early on at the opening of this very map, certain things have already occurred as far as it relates to these ground forces. Their C4-laden demolition robots had ran towards this firing battery here even before the bomber aircraft started to drop their payloads, and had their armed quad-legged robots provide them fire support, as well as to mutually support their troops now moving into the area as well. Just as these heavy strategic bomber aircraft, 2 of the remaining H-6Ks, which hadn't as of yet, until now, dropped their payloads, this C4-laden demolition robot ran between these 2 that were moving up and this one moving off to guard their flanks, as well as this squad moving up also to lay down fire on the Americans, as their firing position had been set up for the training mission before the invasion, as their battery had troops fill sandbags and create a sandbag emplacement that could be used as a fighting position, including a machine gun nest, and also their forces arrayed with 2 MRAPs, 1 on each end, to guard their flanks of their forces, with their fast Vs behind each gun, of course, and their FDCs for each firing platoon behind them, with their headquarters platoon spread out with its fueler, its M88 armored recovery vehicle, its LMTV trucks, and a tent here for the captain and the first sergeant. And as this was going on, their actual headquarters and support battery over the whole battalion, the 4th of the 3rd, was right here, just as the first munitions began to land right here. As you can see, as they move forward and blast, they leave a cloud of dust behind them where they went off, throwing up dust and debris and smoke into the air. As these C4-laden demolition bots ran up, one successfully having placed a charge on this howitzer before running back to the relative safety of behind this hilltop right here, with this one running up taking heavy fire but being supported by the armed quad-legged robots firing at these howitzers, where it planted a C4 charge on a fast V before it was finally destroyed by these troops firing incessantly into it, although it did plant the charge. And the charges ended up being detonated shortly thereafter, but not before this gun line managed to get off some indirect fire. As again, right as the 2 H-6K heavy strategic bombers that had the electronic warfare systems on them, the KG600 electromagnetic jamming pods, right before they were about to leave, due to communications being jammed, due to the satellites being down, America having no ISR capabilities at this time, as they were all eliminated, and the cyber attack occurred, the military networks and satellite feeds that these howitzers and gun lines depended on, as well as our FDCs, were all out of commission. So they had to make educated guesses on where to fire based on what scouting forces came back and told them. But as the H-6Ks with the electronic warfare assets began to leave the area, as the whole bomber squad was about to leave as soon as these 2 finished, they were to trail behind as the last 2 of the squadron leaving the area. They had their radios restored, although not their networks and satellite feed-based information, data transfers, as all the military satellites were gone. But they could communicate via radio for a very short amount of time. But this mattered not, as these two H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft moving into the area were literally about to flatten them. Two of the firing batteries out of the four were driving up this range road out in these training ranges parallel to one another. You had three guns, an FDC, three fast Vs. So what you had here essentially was this battery being configured with its command elements and headquarters platoon leading up front, followed by one platoon with its FDC, its three fast Vs, its three howitzers, and an FDC being one platoon. And then you had another FDC and another gun platoon here. And they were all in a line like this, two batteries. Each had their fueler, their M88 armed recovery, 4 MRAPs, 4 LMTVs, and of course more behind that. But as they were moving up the road, they were being smashed as this H-6K heavy strategic bomber came in this way, and then you had one crisscrossing the area with it, as this one was, by this point up here, this one was here and moving upward, smashing elements of the two support battalions that moved into the area and set up logistical points and first aid stations, combat aid stations, rather, forward deployed. And they totally smashed them as they began to drop their munitions about here, kicking up the dust from where they had already went off as they continued dropping and blasting. They continued to move up the line, smashing this entire firing battery that managed to get off one shot before it had been completely destroyed, with the headquarters and support battery, the headquarters of headquarters and support battery over the entire battalion getting smashed right here, along with these two firing batteries, as this H-6K heavy strategic bomber went up the line. As you can see, the arrow indicates where they're moving, and it's encapsulated in red, meaning they're all destroyed, as this one went completely up the line, just pounding the area, destroying all these forces of the gun line, while these were just out of range of the blast radiuses of these heavy saturating munitions that covered this entire area. As they were right on the outer radius, they instead were now hit by CH-901A loitering munitions. There's 5 right here, and then there's another 2 here coming in, with the C4 that was already detonated before even the H-6Ks got here. They detonated and made a huge blast and shredded the surrounding vehicles around this fast V and horribly damaged this gun from its back, as well as this one detonating and destroying this gun and essentially crippling the one next to it and this MRAP as well, and this fast V behind it. And then the CH-901As finished off the others that hadn't just yet had been destroyed at the time that these demolitions were set off. Now, as this was a 1 kilometer by 1 mile map, the gun line was spaced out a bit more than it appears, but they were still annihilated due to the sheer power of these C4 demolition charges having destroyed this whole gun platoon here and some of the headquarters platoon of this particular battery, this just being one battery right here. There was an ATV coming in, a Gator ATV from one of the training coordinators who was now acting as a scout to try to help them better direct their fire, but he was intercepted as these squads bounded and covered tactically into position and laid down ample small arms fire on him as he made it here, shredding him up, as this became a crater shortly before he made it to the even here. But he was already on the way, so all of that happened as he was driving in, where he got fired upon. So many different things happen at the same time in battle that it's always difficult to articulate them in some semblance of an order, although it can be attempted in the best way possible. As that was happening, this aid station up on this hill, adjacent to this range road, had a sandbag emplacement around it just for training purposes, again, as they were practicing setting up aid stations in the field, and also logistical supply points, such as this platoon here, consisting of a maintenance section, the fueler, supply trucks, and MRAPs for security. And these additional trucks here, 2 armored ambulances in the form of 2 M113 APCs as ambulances, as they often were utilized in that role when it came to combat medics. And other elements were destroyed as these first heavy, thousands of pounds worth of munitions saturated this area as they went up straight up the line, annihilating everything in its path as it went up the line. As this one crisscrossed with the already horribly saturated area here from this one came in as this one was already over here. This one was coming in here, leveled this entire firing battery, as much of it's already beneath the blast here, and it got the rest of it as it overpassed, before continuing to unload and jettison its munitions off map against the support companies of the support battalions in the area, 2 of which were in the area, providing logistical support and other support to these firing batteries of the 4th of the 3rd. As again, both the 15th Sustainment Brigade and the 1st Armored Division's Divisional Artillery Brigade were both visiting units and training together with the 75th Field Artillery Brigade at the time of the invasion, as they came from El Paso, Fort Bliss. And there's a pair of Su-35s entering the area. They're each dropping an FAB 1000, which is actually a 2,000 pounder, and these are free fall munitions, so they're swooping down to essentially do a dive bombing tactic, as they didn't necessarily want to utilize all of their laser guided weapons, as they were very expensive. They tended to save those for the very most important targets while using free fall munitions, as they were much cheaper and far, far more abundant. They were an ample supply, and they would do their dive and release tactics as they would swoop down and then level out and then climb in altitude, going back up to a safe altitude as it pertained to short-range air defenses. Although when they did their dives, they came just within range of these IMSHORAD systems, and some of the SHORAD operators at the very beginning of the opening of this map, as the 2 H6Ks equipped with the KG600s had already jettisoned their load a bit earlier and were now advised to leave the area, leading the rest of the bomber aircraft in pairs. This pair finished, then this pair had finished and followed behind the KG600 equipped pair, and then this one over here had finished. There were 7, so this one had finished and followed, and then these 2 would follow, the one here and the one coming up from Shepherd Air Base. As they dropped their final payloads at the same time as they were doing their strike missions on these 2 SHORAD IM batteries, being the Stryker-based short-range air defense systems with their 30mm autocannons and their 2 Hellfire missiles for self-defense against tanks, as well as their Stinger missiles, which were being fired now up at these aircraft, now that their radars came back on as the electronic warfare assets left the area. The vehicle-based radars that connected to the missile system, which could lock on and track a target and therefore be able to fire a missile at that specific locked-on target. They now fired a few Stinger missiles, although as they did so, this man down here, as part of this SHORAD battalion as a patrolling platoon, fired a man-portable air defense Stinger missile system at this same jet. Although they did this, though, they failed because this Su-35, as it came down on its attack run, jettisoned flares and illuminated chaff, which combined completely fooled the Stingers, causing them to veer off course and not hit the aircraft as it dropped its massive payload of 4 FAB-500s, which were 1,000 pounds each, and a FAB-1000, which was 2,000 pounds, on this specific battery here, which was also losing some of its vehicles on its outermost edges of its temporary bivouac area to the munitions being dropped as this H-6K flew over, smashing this battery and some other elements that were at the initial blasts where they initially jettisoned their first payload. This all was going on at the same time. As they fired their Stinger, these CH-901A loitering munitions had come in and completely annihilated this entire squad. This being a new volley of CH-901As, and these were armed with HE warheads instead of heat warheads, which were adequate against a lot of different vehicle types and definitely against ground soldiers. So these HE-equipped CH-901A loitering munitions were beginning to hit these different air defense squads of this patrolling platoon that was doing a roving patrol around their firing point, their area where they set up, because they were training at the time of the invasion to operate together between the short-range air defenses, giving cover to the artillery batteries, consisting of the M109A6 Paladins, their Fast V vehicles, their M113 high-top FDC vehicles, as well as their headquarters platoons vehicles. They were operating close to them to give them the best possible air support that they could, as their Stinger system and 30mm autocannon that was fired at aerial targets did not have a very long range or high altitude, but if they operated close to the artillery batteries, they could provide them a fairly decent umbrella of air defense coverage, as the Stinger had a range of just over a few miles, and the 30mm autocannon as well. And as they attempted to fire up at these two extremely fast-moving Su-35s as they detached their payloads onto the batteries, with this one moving here and diving over here, releasing its payloads here into this battery, these two SHORAD batteries were simply destroyed, and their missiles veered off target, and didn't hit this Su-35 here, nor did the man-portable one fired by this roving patrol of air defense troops carrying Stingers at the time, as again, they were training in real-world conditions. They were trying to mimic real-world conditions, real battle conditions. So they were fully armed and equipped with live everything, as not only was the training to mimic real-world circumstances, but also it was a show of force. It was a posturing being done by the different installations, as each installation had a different REDCON status or readiness condition status, or their level of readiness, some way higher than others, such as in El Paso and Fort Bliss. At that battle there, Fort Bliss was, its REDCON status was at the maximum, being it was a border installation, and 90% of their tenant units were fully armed and equipped, although there were still a fair amount that didn't even sign out their weapons and were totally caught with their proverbial pants down at the time of the invasion. But for the most part, they had all signed out their weapons, with a very small exception overall, as it related to all the units on the installation. They also strafed at their targets with their nose cannon as they both flew down to drop their payload of their freefall munitions, their unguided munitions, while jettisoning flares and illuminated chaff, which meant that they could use radar waves bouncing off the chaff cloud to illuminate it and make it appear to radars as if it's the actual target, like a solid object when it's just chaff that's being illuminated by radar waves. And they dropped their munitions, destroyed these two batteries, while this H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft partially destroyed some of the vehicles on the outer radius of its enormous mass munitioning here, as a carpet munitioned this area, flying up and laying massive ordnance on this dispersed artillery battery right here of the 4th of the 3rd, before continuing on and dropping more munitions on another SHORAD battery and its headquarters and support battery, as this one flattened these two firing batteries of the 4th of the 3rd, and also a large portion of this battery here and the actual headquarters battery over the entire battalion, the headquarters and support battery, destroying it as it was like a hinge between these two different firing batteries. And these, at the initiation of this particular battle, were shifting position to set up off to the side, off the map, beside this battery, but off a ways beyond this woods right here. As there were wooded areas, the engineers had initially moved into the area, this being just one of the 5 companies right here. It's headquarters platoon, then it's 3 combat platoons, with all platoons having dismounted their combat engineer troops. This 5 vehicles here, the engineering vehicle, the GPZ-111A, having dismounted its forces. The ones over here, the APCs, the type which were the Type 08s of the APC and IFVs, they had 1 Type 08 IFV per platoon. They had 3 APCs of the Type 08 APCs, and then they each had a GPZ-111A, which is a wheeled armored engineering vehicle. As this platoon of 5 squads, and this one here moving up with the armed robots and demolition robots, 2 of them here, actually 3, I'm sorry, 3 of them here, were moving up into the area. Early on, they had already taken out this roving patrol, this one being from this particular artillery battery, patrolling the area around their firing point, as they would do naturally in a war-type situation. They were ambushed and destroyed by these quad-legged armed robots, being followed up closely by this squad of engineers, part of this platoon here, which had dismounted originally from these vehicles here before they all moved up into this area in a double column, while these spaced out to guard the flanks, with this entire platoon here dismounting and moving up through the center, all 5 of their squads, before all the squads fanned out, moving this way, this way, this way, this way, and this way, to guard a semicircle type area right here, while this platoon provided security for the flanks on this side, while this platoon was with both platoon vehicles of 2 combat platoons, with this dismounted platoon coming from this column right here, guarding this side of their advance, having had moved up already, ambushed the ATV, which was like essentially a scout at this point for the artillery forces, as again, it was a training coordinator from the local 1st of the 79th, helping to coordinate all the training activities, but since the communications were down, he was now being used as a artillery spotter, essentially, relaying information back to these batteries in order to help them provide indirect fire, as again, the first battle that occurred to seize the airfield just to the south of what was occurring here had by this point already been achieved over an hour ago. And the heavy strategic bomber aircraft annihilated many of the artillery forces and 2 support battalions in the area, as this one continued north and this one continued to the east. And many of the units that were unfortunately beneath them were completely annihilated, turned into dust, as these munitions shredded up everything that was on the ground as they landed. As this dismounted patrolling platoon of air defense troops was in the area, the combat engineers moving up this hill from lower ground on the other side, having their vehicles fanning out here to guard the flanks of the rest of their forces and their headquarters, they moved up this hill, this wooded hill here, and 2 sides of this wooded area, and ambushed these roving patrols that had begun as roving patrols during the training, but now were patrolling looking for real enemies, as they realized that upon the battle breaking out that something major was afoot, and it wasn't a small attack. This was a major assault deep in their installation. And by this point, they were all on red alert, even without their communications equipment working initially. And now that it worked, they could better coordinate their movements, although by this point it was too late, as, again, combination of sheer massive air power in the form of 2 heavy strategic bombers, even pairs of Su-35s still operating in the area that hadn't, as of this point until now, jettisoned their munitions, in addition to CH-901A loitering munitions coming down upon them, with the mixture of ground forces that were equipped with armed robots, very powerful IFVs, APCs, and combat engineering vehicles, armored engineering vehicles, moving into place, all with the concentrated firepower available from these forces. And the aircraft completely annihilated all in their wake. These loitering munitions helped sufficiently in that regard as well, 4 of which having targeted this squad of air defense troops and annihilated them with their HE warheads, 1 moving towards this squad as it ran to assist the other 2 squads up on this side of this hill. And they were hit by the CH-901A, eliminating many of them, while the 2 squads of combat engineers vectored their fire down upon them, including 35mm tube-launched grenades beneath rifles, light machine gun fire, even Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades, the Chinese types, with anti-personnel rounds. In addition to the anti-tank rounds carried, they fired their anti-personnel rounds down at them, and the shrapnel from the tube-launched grenades, the Type 69s, as well as the light machine gun fire, simply shredded these squads up, in addition to the loitering munitions hitting them as well. These guys that just happened to survive the enormous airstrikes occurring just to their north and northeast. In the center, again, initially, these armed robots annihilated this roving patrol of artillery troops, while these forces moved into position and began to engage these forces here of this artillery battery before it was wiped out by this strategic heavy bomber moving in. This all happening in concurrence with the initial dropping of munitions by this H-6K. They were already firing back and forth, but by then it was too late and they were wiped out. All in all, this is just one segment of the larger battle, as the other 4 of 5 combat engineer companies were operating slightly to the south as well as slightly to the east, with this one company taking position in the center, as the forces on the main map had again moved north from bypassing the airfield on its eastern side before hooking to the west and engaging these battalions. These 2 from the 15th Sustainment Brigade that were originally training with the 1st Armored Division's Divisional Artillery Brigade and its subordinate battalions, along with the 75th Field Artillery Brigade, who they initially came to train with in a fairly large exercise from moving here from Fort Bliss, the 15th Sustainment and the 1st Armored Division Divisional Artillery Brigade. These two brigades coming here for training. There were essentially, in other words, just in this area where this battle was occurring, there were 4 whole battalions, most of which having been smashed by H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft, this one having earlier hit the 3rd of the 13th at the airfield battle, initially opening the whole battle at the installation, with this other one moving up from the battle at Shepherd and joining this one here with one going this way and the other going this way, as shown on this map where they cross paths. As this one moved forward, this one came in this area diagonally, slightly, while these remaining Su-35s that still had their munitions jettisoned them on top of these batteries and completely wiped them out. Also, they fired air-to-ground S-25 laser-guided rockets as well, these having been fired slightly further back, as they had a range of over 3 miles, roughly 3.2. They also hit their targets, even as this one had swooped down to drop its 5 enormous munitions on this one, the same as had been done on this one, with a 2,000-pounder and 4 1,000-pounders, completely leveling this battery just as was done here. But this one was also hit by air-fired air-to-ground rockets, the S-25s being fired from these Su-35s, as this one even fired at this battery back here. All in all, by the time this battle here had ended, just this one section, it lasted a total of 20 minutes. By now, it was past 3:30 a.m. in the invasion. And although they had lost a few of their robots, the engineers had suffered extremely light casualties, having only had lost 4 KIAs in just this specific battle here to the initial fire before the heavy airstrikes came in addition to the CH-901A loitering munitions flying over them to hit specific targets on AI targeting mode. The fire laid down by these troops, the dismounts, as they moved ahead of their vehicles to protect their vehicles and their headquarters platoon, fire laid down by them, even in terms of small arms, including light machine guns, as well as general purpose machine guns, and the heavy machine guns carried into battle by their armed robots, laid down enormous fire upon their enemies, even with their light anti-armor weapons in the form of the Type 69 Chinese RPGs, firing anti-personnel rounds at the American dismounted air defense troops patrolling their area of operations, in addition to 35mm tube-fired from beneath rifle barrel grenades, fired from beneath the the QBZ-95 Chinese assault rifles wielded by the individual troops. With the artillery hitting areas behind the engineers, hitting empty areas, in other words, although getting close with their indirect fire to hitting the troops that were now occupying the southeast corner airfield here. They got close to hitting them, but they didn't exactly hit them. They hit just short of the airfield itself, and these shells evidently came to naught, although they tried, and they put up some small arms fire in return against the armed robots and combat engineers. they achieved very little, as they simply couldn't withstand the combined might of strike aircraft, heavy strategic bomber aircraft, as well as the ground forces and their loitering munitions. Again, with the Chinese having total ISR dominance with their constellation of squad-level reconnaissance drones, they got the drop on these dismounted Americans as well as the gun lines before they were smashed by airstrikes and C4 planting by their demolition robots as well as their armed robots, which fired their heavy 12.7 millimeter machine guns into these positions, as well as the dismounted troops as soon as they moved up and took position as well. All happening roughly in tandem. And thus, the battle ended in a very short time, at least in this specific battle segment. Although this was over in 20 minutes, the other companies of the battalion, of the 5 sent to this specific area to engage these 4 American battalions, the 2 from the 15th Sustainment, which were logistical units, as well as the 4th of the 60th SHORAD, or Short Range Air Defense Battalion, and the 4th of the 3rd, which was essentially completely destroyed in this area with some of the SHORAD elements off map to the north. But they were destroyed by the strategic aircraft in the form of this one H-6K heavy strategic bomber as it flew into the slight northeast. There were still tiny groupings of dismounted American troops that tried to put up resistance, and the overall fighting, therefore, ended up coming to an end. Although this part ended, the other 4 companies engaging tiny groups of fleeing dismounts by this point, mostly from the support units, they wrapped up their last fighting by about 3:40 or minutes after this battle ended at about 3:30. So by 3:40, the whole battle was over in terms of the 5 combat engineer combat companies engaging the 4th of the 60th, the 4th of the 3rd, which is the field artillery, with the aircraft largely decimating them, with the airstrikes from the Su-35s mostly decimating a large portion of the 4th of the 60th, with the H-6K also eliminating its headquarters battery of the SHORAD air defense element. They still had to fight tiny bands of logistical and support troops that were still operating in this area from the 2 battalions dispatched for training to provide frontline support during the training mission that the elements of the 1st Armored Division's Divisional Artillery Brigade, its subordinate battalions, were conducting. So by 3:40, as the fighting here in this area was completely wrapping up, there was still combat occurring in other parts of the installation, as there were still tiny bands of troops that were also part of the 15th Sustainment currently engaged here by these 2 combat engineer battalions that initially came into this area and surrounded them in pockets. There were still vicious small arms firefights occurring in this area, although most of the major fighting had wrapped up as soon as the artillery had come in and smashed these larger battalions, breaking them up into very tiny bands of disorganized, panicked troops, in addition to 2 of the H-6Ks leveling a lot of these battalion elements insofar as their vehicles and a lot of troops were concerned, even with the J-11 squadron having earlier came in to provide close air support for some of the companies operating against the 100th Brigade Sport Battalion, the headquarters battery, and a fleeing element of 1 battery that was supposed to join the rest of their battalion, the 3rd of the 13th, that had a little bit of which fled the 122mm rocket strikes, only to be hit by the close air support from the J-11s as well as CH-901A loitering munitions and ground fire from the engineers. Although the tiny bands of troops would need to be mopped up, which would take a little bit more time, there was still another part of the installation that was engaged in large-scale fighting. And as the drill sergeants and TRADOC personnel tried to rally the trainees and give them live ammunition at the initiation of this entire battle and pull them out of the inner training areas to organize them, tiny assaults had been attempted once the Special Operations Forces had seized the Henry Army Airfield, which were viciously repelled, resulting in huge casualties, as by this point a few hundred of these trainees, led by a few drill sergeants, had been slaughtered as they had tried to cross the interstate from the eastern gate, passing the interstate to the western gate, and were repulsed and destroyed. But there were still hundreds of more trainees being organized for a last push against the Henry Army Airfield. But these special operations troops of the PLA were damn sure not pushovers. And these feeble trainees, with their small arms and crew serve weapons, couldn't hope to beat them, but they were going to try, as the drill sergeants didn't know what else to do. The next video will be the fairly large engagement that occurred at the Henry Army Airfield between two full special operations battalions that were now in place and setting up a defensive perimeter to hold the airfield as the rest of the battle was now wrapping up, as well as fending off sporadic attacks from a grouping of MPs from the first of the 354th MP Battalion, this being roughly 3 companies of them, causing them to begin to flee the area, eventually trying to go north, but the Special Operations Forces would dispatch a few of their companies to meet and destroy them, not allowing them to escape, but that would come later in the fighting, as the next battle occurred at 4 a.m. between the Special Operations Battalions and hundreds of trainees returning from the inner training areas that hadn't as of yet been directly attacked, and also organizing them into a manner by which they would even attempt to take back the airfield, as that was seen by at least the drill sergeants on the tactical level as a way that they could get possible reinforcements, thinking that somehow, some way, Americans would conduct an air assault operation to try to relieve them, or maybe an airborne operation and using the airfield, but that was all delusion and fantasy and would never happen. Although delusion and fantasy, when desperate times become desperate times, desperate people do desperate things, and they hold on to desperate illusions and delusions, and therefore they would make the attempt to try to capture the Henry Army Airfield. That is next in the Battle of Fort Sill and Lawton in Oklahoma, part of the Texas or South Central Invasion Sector Hypothetical Invasion documentary series, which conveys all the aspects of 4th generation warfare doctrines developed by the Chinese, combining Trojan shock forces with external forces moving in from outside the nation, in conjunction with high levels of technology, many of which never before used en masse in warfare or used at all. Next comes the battle at Henry Army Airfield,